preservation options. Here is your host, the Harvard-educated fertility specialist, Dr. Amy.
She's known as the Egg Whisperer.
Fertility expert Dr. Amy Avazadeh.
And you have yet another success story
Just launched by an East Bay fertility doctor.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining me tonight for another episode of the Egg Whisperer Show. If you don't know who I am, it's okay. I'm Dr. Amy Avazadeh. You can think of my last name as Have a Nice Day or a vase of flowers a day, but most patients call me Dr. Amy, and I'm a fertility doctor, which basically means I spent a lot of time in school figuring out that an egg and sperm, when they come together, they make a baby. And I love what I do. It's super fun. I love what I do so much that I dedicate every Wednesday in the evening to this show so I can talk about fertility topics that mean a lot to me, that I think will really help the viewers out there and anyone from wherever you are in the world. You can learn just a little bit about fertility and apply it to whatever is going on with you. So the topic of tonight's show is the ultimate 4-step guide to IVF. And I basically apply these 4 rules to every single case, every patient that I have that comes to my office. And I said to myself, you know what? I want everyone to know what my recipe for success is. I know that not everyone I help will be successful because that's just human biology. But I know if I apply these 4 rules to everybody's case, then I know that we're never going to look back and wish that we had done something differently or that there wasn't a test that I hadn't offered someone. So you're probably wondering, what are these 4 steps? And I came up with this really simple mnemonic, and I'm going to call this the Egg Whisperer D.I.E.T, because you can remember things easily if you have a simple mnemonic. So the D.I.E.T stands for, I'm just going to tell you all my secrets right now: diagnosis, IVF, endometrial receptivity, and transfer. And I should really call it the Egg Whisperer D.I.E.T with an S at the end, because the S would stand for stay pregnant. Because certainly not only do we worry about getting pregnant, but when you're a patient who has struggled so much for a pregnancy, you're always going to be worried, especially in the first trimester and even beyond, about whether you're going to stay pregnant. So the S is about staying pregnant and being able to also carry a pregnancy to term. So I'm going to start with the D first. So the D is diagnosis, okay? So whenever you're planning an IVF cycle for me, I always want to know what the diagnosis is. And the reason is this: if I know what the problem is, then there might be something that I can do to improve the situation so that when we're doing IVF, we're going to have our very, very best chance ever. The other thing is, if you know what the diagnosis is, you're better prepared for, let's say, the number of cycles you'll need. Or you'll have a better understanding as to what's the right protocol for you. So let's talk a little bit about the testing that we can do. And when it comes to testing, it's fairly straightforward: egg, sperm, and tube. It takes 3 things to have a baby: egg, sperm, and fallopian tube. So you kind of want to understand all 3 things going into an IVF cycle, or at some point even before transfer. And I'll talk about those 3 things right now, starting with eggs. So when we look at eggs, we look at age, we look at FSH estradiol levels, and these levels change over time, and they're checked between cycle days 1 through 4. And they give us a really good idea as to what's going on with your fertility and how strong your eggs are. Certainly, you're not a number, and just because you have one level that shows something doesn't mean that that defines you. But these are extremely useful diagnostic tools, and if we look at these levels over time, you'll have a really good picture as to what's going on with your fertility. So you go into your IVF cycle with your eyes wide open, understanding full well what the expectations should be. The other thing we look at are follicles and the antral follicle count. So antral follicles are these little fluid-filled sacs that contain eggs. And when a patient comes to my office, we take a look at the number of follicles that she has. And based on that number, I can then design the best protocol for her, whether it's a start using birth control pills, which I call them IVF preparation pills, because no one wants to be given a pill called birth control when you're trying to get pregnant, duh. And then the other thing we look at is the AMH level, which stands for anti-Müllerian hormone. And this is a level that very normally declines over time. We all run out of AMH, and what we don't want to do is run out before we've completed our family. So looking at all these levels together can really help give us a really nice picture about someone's eggs and their egg quality. And I designed a website called eggwhisperer.com for anyone, anywhere, to get a really nice idea about their levels with a consult by me. I can take a look at your levels, look at your fertility history, family history, talk about your future family size goals, and come up with a nice plan for you and decide when we should check again and whether you should think about things like egg freezing, IVF, and what other treatment options you can consider if you're not considering IVF at this time. So some other tests that we can do that look at egg quality potentially is this test called My Fertilome. That's actually the website. The test itself is called Fertilome, and you can go to the website and read more about it, but it's basically a fertility gene test. And I find it useful because it tells me if a patient, let's say, has a genetic variant for something that may make us have perhaps less genetically viable eggs out of a batch than I would expect for her age. Well, that's something that I might want to know before I start an IVF cycle so that I have a patient that's very well prepared for possibly doing more than one cycle for her to reach her family size goals and get the number of embryos that she wants, okay? So then we talked about eggs, and remember, for diagnosis, it's egg, sperm, and tubes. So now talking about the swimmers. So when it comes to the swimmers, it's not just about how many swimmers you have, although that's really important. But when you're doing IVF, it literally just takes one egg and one sperm cell to make an embryo. And so there are a number of tests that I like to talk to patients about. So depending on where you live, it may not be so easy to get a really detailed semen analysis. Well, there's a company called Reprosource, and they offer a test called the Home Collection Kit. It's a temperature-controlled kit that gets shipped to your home, and then you basically do your thing in a cup and then send the sample off, and I get a very detailed report looking at things just as if you had gone to an IVF lab, looking at the shape of the head of the sperm, neck of the sperm, tail of the sperm, looking at round cells, all the same things that you would have done at an IVF lab. This report will provide the same amount of information. It's a great test, especially for really busy people or people who do not live close to an IVF center to get a really good analysis done. Another test is called Episona. So they look at epigenetics of sperm. They look at actual genetic locations in the sperm cells that may make embryo development less efficient, might cause miscarriages. You know, those are the kinds of things I would want to know before I started a cycle. And it's not one of those things where you would get a result back and say, you can't move forward. No, the results would come back and then they would say, well, this is what you could do differently moving forward. So depending on the results, as you may know, a sperm life cycle is 2 months. It isn't like us for women. I mean, certainly men have a biological clock, just like women do, but their clock's a little bit different. So men are still making sperm, and the sperm life cycle is around 2 months or so. And there are things that guys can do that can both positively and negatively affect their sperm. So if you find out that there are some genetic issues with the sperm, believe it or not, you can actually improve them with lifestyle changes, improving your testosterone levels through medications like, let's say, Clomid or Arimidex or even HCG shots. There are a number of things that you can do. So this is all part of the D part of my Egg Whisperer diet to help you have the most efficient and successful IVF pregnancy possible. Another test is the DNA fragmentation test. So this test is a very useful tool because what you can find if you just do a quick Google search or go to PubMed, which is my version of Google, you'll find that men with a higher DNA fragmentation in their sperm have a lower likelihood of having a pregnancy that results in a live birth. And what can be very, very frustrating for so many people out there is you go through IVF, you do everything that you think you're supposed to do, you even do genetic testing of the embryos are chromosomally normal, and then you transfer them, and then you miscarry. So when it comes to looking at DNA fragmentation, I think it's particularly important just like the Episona test is, because there are things that you can do before your IVF cycle so that whenever you're ready to collect the eggs, you're using the very best sperm possible so you have the most successful IVF cycle and transfer. And so you can do the S part of my Egg Whisperer D.I.E.T, which is stay pregnant. So egg, sperm, and tubes, those are the three parts of the Egg Whisperer D part of the diet. See, you're all going to be fertility experts by the end of this show, I promise you. When it comes to fallopian tubes, if I know a patient needs IVF, I don't need to check tubes right away. And the reason is this: you don't need fallopian tubes to get pregnant with IVF. In fact, IVF was invented for women with blocked fallopian tubes. But whenever you're going to put an embryo back in, if let's say a fallopian tube is dilated or filled with fluid, like with a hydrosalpinx, that embryo might have a lower rate of implanting if you're transferring when a patient has a hydrosalpinx. Or if a patient has a blocked fallopian tube, that embryo can swim up into the fallopian tube, and if it's blocked, it won't get pushed back into the uterus. So that patient has a higher risk of an ectopic pregnancy. A lot of people don't know that one of the first pregnancies in a human being from IVF was actually an ectopic pregnancy. So that's why it's something that we do as part of the process before we do a transfer. So there are a number of ways of looking at tubes. So one is through saline bubbles. It's a very simple ultrasound test. There's a company called FemView that has a really nifty syringe catheter system, and it's done under ultrasound. So there's no radiation, no X-ray exposure. The other way to do it is through the hysterosalpingogram, okay? Hystero is uterus, salpingo tube, gram is picture. So we're taking a picture of the uterus, fallopian tubes, and this is done usually at an imaging center. There is a great local fertility clinic where I send my patients to, as well as a couple imaging centers in our area. And so it's basically an ultrasound, it's basically like a pap smear under X-ray guidance. So the doctor has a catheter inside the cervix, just like the FemView procedure, and rather than pushing saline, they're pushing a radiopaque dye that will fill the uterus up and then come out the fallopian tubes while shooting images at the same time. So you, for the most part, get an answer right away as to whether your fallopian tubes are open or blocked. So other testing that we do are preconception labs, looking at thyroid, looking at cholesterol if needing, looking at blood sugar, depending on your age, doing a mammogram. So the number of tests on our checklist that we do before we go into the IVF cycle to make sure that we're not missing anything. So what other things? Couple others. So I describe carrier screening as a way to make sure the egg and sperm are genetically compatible. No matter what you find, there's always something you can do with the results that will be helpful. And what I mean by that is this. Take, for example, you have two people that are carriers for a disease like, let's say, Wilson's disease. Well, Wilson's disease is something that if you knew that an embryo had it and you were going to have a baby with it, where there's certain treatments that you could do right away so that baby had a really healthy life. Some people might choose to screen their embryos for a disease if both the egg and sperm were carriers for that disease, so that they wouldn't have a child with that disease. Wilson is an example. Cystic fibrosis is another example we hear of quite often. But when you're doing genetic testing on embryos, a lot of people think you can see everything. People ask me all the time, can I choose the baby's eye color, hair color? And I say, absolutely not. There's no such thing. We can't create designer babies. We really, really can't. And I don't see that day coming anytime soon. But what we can do is look at chromosomes, 1 through 22 plus X and Y. And then the only way we can look at a disease in an embryo if we know what the egg and sperm carry. So the way you do that is through an extended carrier screening. There are a number of companies that offer that. There's also a company called GenePeaks. And what that company does is that they look at like 1,000 genes between both the egg and the sperm. And they don't give you a carrier report and tell you what you carry. They'll basically give you a report that tells you if there are any diseases that your baby could have when the two of you come together. Okay? So now we come to diagnosis, and now the next part is IVF. So that's the I part of the Egg Whisperer diet. See, you're never going to forget this. No, I'm not talking about food. I'm the worst chef ever. The only thing I can make is a omelet. I swear to God, and I say that a lot every single day. I think it's really funny. So when it comes to IVF, if you know the D, you know the diagnosis, then it really, really helps you understand what the protocol is. and take time asking questions. Ask, why am I on this protocol? Why did you choose it for me? Do you think I could benefit from supplements? Do you think that HGH, there's a role for that? Why would you or would you not use estrogen as a priming or testosterone priming? Birth control pills, remember I called them IVF readiness pills. Why are they being used for me? Would it be better if I didn't take them? All those questions should be answered before your cycle. And when it comes to the medications that are being used for you, ask the same questions. Ask about the why, ask about the side effects. I get so many people that ask me these questions from centers from all over, and I say to myself, I don't understand why people don't ask their own doctors. So take your time to ask your questions and don't leave the office until they're asked. And there's so many great nurses, so many great doctors out there. If you ask them the questions, they want you to know the answers because the most informed patients are going to be the most successful patients. Most of my patients opt for something called PGS, also known as CCS or complete chromosome screening. PGS stands for pre-implantation genetic screening. And then if, let's say, the egg and sperm both carry a disease, we can also do PGD. A lot of people consider this controversial, but what I say is we're still dealing with an imperfect science. It's a murky crystal ball. It's still not 100%, even to this day. We've been doing PGS, at least I have, since I started my practice. It's been almost 10 years. We're getting better and better with it. It's more and more sensitive. But what people need to realize is an embryo has a tiny little bit of DNA. And so when an embryo grows, you learn more about it. And I've had cases myself where I've had patients where I thought I transferred a normal embryo. It's happened 3 or 4 times in the last 10 years. And the patient miscarried, and then I actually tested the pregnancy, and the pregnancy was actually chromosomally abnormal. And people would say to me, well, how does this happen? And what I say is this is exactly why I test it. I test it both when I transfer it, and if something doesn't work, I still want to know why. And what it just shows is that while the technology is good, we know from studies that pregnancy rates are higher and miscarriage rates are lower. It's still not perfect. So I recommend that everyone who's going to do it consider a genetic consultation so that they can learn about the technology that their doctor is using for them, and then talk to the genetic counselor at that company to learn about the limitations before you do it. The other thing my patients benefit from is something called the MITO score. The MITO score is a mitochondrial DNA count that tells me about the implantation rate of each embryo. So if you didn't know that something like this existed, well, how would you know that you could even ask for it? So again, ask questions, talk to your doctor, see if this is something that would be right for you to get from your genetic testing results. My patients get it. I want you to see if it's right for you as well. Okay? So we talked about the diagnosis, we talked about IVF, and the E part of diet is endometrial receptivity. And so I consider receptivity kind of like your E.V.I.T for your embryo. You want to send your embryo an invitation to implant at the very perfect time. But how would you know what time to tell the embryo to show up unless you did very specific testing? So if I have a patient that has so many embryos, well, sometimes we just transfer. We transfer, and most of the time, everything works out great. But the average age of my patient is about 39 or more. And what this means is most patients usually get, at best, 1 or 2 genetically normal embryos in a batch. And you can imagine if you have only 1 or 2 embryos, you would want to do everything possible to give each embryo its very best chance. So that's why I like to do endometrial receptivity testing in this sort of patient. I certainly offer it to everybody, but I make sure that patients who have 1 or 2 embryos, or only the number of embryos they need for their future family size, really know about these tests first. I can't imagine what it would feel like to do something, have it not work, and then have someone say, well, there were other tests that I could have done. Well, we're in 2017, almost 2018 now, and technology is always changing. And right now, these are the tests that we have. I wish there was one test that I could do that could just do all of this, but unfortunately, we still have to take a number of steps to get all these answers before we do a transfer. So the ERA test is one of the endometrial receptivity tests, stands for Endometrial Receptivity Assay. I run my patients through a mock embryo transfer before their transfer, and that's basically taking the same medications that you would take for the transfer, combination of estrogen, and then estrogen and progesterone, and then we do a really gentle biopsy on the lining of the uterus, send cells off, and find out if I gave the patient the right number of hours of progesterone for them, right? It's basically the timestamp or the time for your E.V.I.T for the embryo party. So the other test is looking at a hormone level or a protein called BCL6. It's a marker of inflammation and endometriosis in the lining of the uterus. So with that same biopsy that I do for the ERA test, I also send cells to this company as well. Just one biopsy, cells go into 2 little small containers, and I get results about 5 days later from the Receptiva test, about 2 weeks later from the ERA test, and then when a patient's period starts after the biopsy, we start meds again and get ready for transfer. So now that comes to the T part of the Egg Whisperer diet, transfer. So we talked about diagnosis, IVF, endometrial receptivity, and last but not least, transferring. So now you're at your transfer day, okay? So what are you not gonna do? You're not gonna transfer on a day that's super stressful. Maybe you have visitors in town. Maybe you have 7 visitors in town. Maybe you have your boss coming. Maybe you're the CEO of a company and you have investors in town the next day for you to present to. That's not the ideal situation. So when it comes to transferring, I want you to be like this person over here in the water, totally chill. And I want you to do everything possible to be as relaxed as possible, as zen as possible, and as positive as possible. Because when I transfer, I always tell my patients, reserve a little bit of your heart in case it doesn't work. But I truly believe every transfer I do is going to work. And the other sort of outlook I have is whether it works or not, we have to be okay. And there's always going to be a plan if something doesn't work. And when patients have transfers that don't work, I certainly bring them in and we go through everything and talk about why potentially it didn't work so that we can be as informed as possible going into the next transfer. But a couple of things that you can do to be as relaxed as possible for transfer is use calm apps like calm.com, calm.com, ferticom.com. It sounds funny for me to say that. Say that 10 times. Other apps would be Circle and Bloom. And then certainly acupuncture. One of my dear friends, Dr. Laura Shaheen, has written a great book about acupuncture called Planting the Seeds of Pregnancy. And it really provides a really nice explanation as to why people should consider acupuncture, not only for fertility, but I also think acupuncture helps in all things medically related, but especially in the first trimester of pregnancy. When you're feeling super sick and you want to puke all the time, believe it or not, acupuncture treatments can lower your symptoms of nausea. So that's also something to consider. So that's my Egg Whisperer diet. It's really as simple as that. Those are the 4 steps to my ultimate IVF guide. Is it that easy? I know it isn't. If you go through all those steps, you're talking about lots of blood draws, you're talking about lots of ultrasounds, tests, and certainly cost. But the cost of going through an IVF cycle that doesn't work, the emotional cost, it's high. But going through all these tests and delaying things to get through all of them, well, it's not so fun, but we try to make things as easy and fun as possible for my patients. I know IVF stands for in vitro fertilization, but we also like to think that it stands for is very fun. At least it is in my office. So at the end of the day, I want everyone to ask questions. Remember the Egg Whisperer diet. Tune in back here, and if you missed a show, you can go to my YouTube channel and subscribe. We'll be here next Wednesday. I'm really excited about next Wednesday's I was going to say appointment, but next Wednesday's show is all about acupuncture, and I'm actually going to have Dr. Laura Shaheen and her co-author Stephanie on the show to talk about the benefits of acupuncture in and with fertility treatments, and I hope that you can join me next Wednesday. So thank you again for tuning in tonight. I hope you found this show really helpful. You can always email questions ahead, and I really hope you have a great night. We'll see you soon.
Welcome to the Egg Whisperer Show, a program exclusively designed to promote reproductive health awareness and discuss fertility preservation options. Here is your host, the Harvard-educated fertility specialist, Dr. Amy.
She's known as the Egg Whisperer.
Fertility expert Dr. I.V.F.
And you have yet another success story.
Just launched by an East Bay fertility doctor.
Welcome to the Egg Whisperer Show, a program exclusively designed to promote reproductive health awareness and discuss